The Gilded Oak, Virginia. A woman sits in a sweltering car watching heat radiate off the hood, while inside the gates a fairy tale begins. My name is Nancy Collins, and everyone inside that tent thinks I am here to celebrate love. They don't know that I am actually here to investigate a crime. My parents stole $100,000 from me to pay for this party gambling that I would be too polite to scream. They were wrong. The air smells of expensive lilies and betrayal, and I'm about to set a match to the entire illusion. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Here is the story. The heat in the overflow parking lot was aggressive, the kind that didn't just sit on your skin but pushed against it. I sat in my 10-year-old Honda Civic with the engine off, watching the heat shimmer distort the hood. Through the windshield, I could see the sleek black procession of luxury SUVs and hired town cars gliding toward the main entrance of the Gilded Oak. They looked like they belonged to a different species than my dented sedan. They moved with the silent confidence of money-depositing guests who were already laughing, already celebrating, already drunk on the promise of a perfect evening. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down, expecting a text from my mother asking where I was, or perhaps a demand to bring the extra box of programs I'd been tasked with carrying. Instead, the screen lit up with a notification from my bank app. It was a low-balance alert for an account I hadn't touched in weeks. My stomach gave a strange, hollow lurch. That account was supposed to be dormant, waiting for a repayment that was already 2 months late. I swiped the notification away, telling myself it was a glitch. I grabbed the box of programs from the passenger seat and stepped out into the humid Virginia afternoon. The Gilded Oak was a sprawling estate repurposed as a wedding venue, the kind of place that charged you for the air you breathed. As I walked toward the side entrance, the designated path for help and vendors, a woman with a headset and a clipboard intercepted me. She looked frazzled, her blowout wilting in the humidity. "Ms. Collins?" she asked, her eyes darting to the box in my arms. "Yes," I said, shifting the weight. "I'm the groom's sister, just bringing these in." "Oh, thank God," she exhaled, making a tick mark on her clipboard. "We had a question about the final authorization for the raw bar extension. Since you're the primary on the billing file, I just needed to verify if we're capping the oysters at 500 or letting it run." I stopped walking. The gravel crunched loudly under my sensible heels. "Excuse me?" She looked up, blinking. "The raw bar. For the cocktail hour. You're listed as the billing contact for the catering add-ons. I just wanted to check before we open the station." "I think you have me confused with my mother, Patricia," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden rapid thumping of my heart. "Or the bride, Madison." The woman frowned, flipping a page. "No, the card on file for the incidentals ends in 4492. Nancy Collins. That's you, right?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis just a fraction. 4492. That was my debit card, the one connected to my primary savings. "Ms. Collins." "Let it run," I heard myself say. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone standing 3 feet to my left. "If people want oysters, let them have oysters." "Perfect. Thanks." She bustled away, shouting something into her headset. I stood there in the service entrance, holding a box of satin-ribboned programs, staring at the white tent peeking over the hedge. I didn't come here today to ruin a wedding. I came because I thought I was part of a family. But standing in the shadow of that tent, I realized I hadn't just been invited to a celebration. I had been invited to a crime scene. To understand why I didn't just drop the box and scream right then and there, you have to understand the Collins family ecosystem. In our solar system, my brother Ethan was the sun. He was charismatic, golden-haired, and effortlessly successful in that vague way that required a lot of capital but produced very little evident work. My parents, Patricia and Robert, were the gravity that held him in place, constantly adjusting the universe to ensure Ethan never felt the cold. And I was the moon. Reliable, quiet, orbiting at a safe distance, reflecting their light but never generating my own. I was the easy one, the one who didn't cause drama. While Ethan was backpacking through Europe on Dad's credit card to find himself, I was working double shifts at a logistics firm, eating ramen, and driving a car that smelled faintly of old coffee. I wasn't bitter about it, or at least I told myself I wasn't. I was practical. I had a goal. For 7 years, I had been building a fortress out of dollar bills. My dream wasn't flashy. I didn't want a yacht or a penthouse. I wanted the Miller House, a small, derelict Victorian on the edge of town that everyone else saw as a teardown, but I saw as a life. I wanted autonomy. I wanted a front door that I owned, walls I could paint, and the silence of a life that belonged solely to me. I had saved $100,000. It was a nice, round, impossible number. It was the down payment and the renovation budget. It was my freedom. I treated that savings account like a sacred object. It was the only thing in my life that was undeniably mine. Or so I thought. The trap had been set 6 months ago at my parents' kitchen table. The memory was so sharp it felt like a physical cut. I had come over for Sunday dinner expecting pot roast and polite conversation. Instead, I found a wake. My mother was weeping into a handkerchief, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. My father, usually a stoic man who hid behind the Wall Street Journal, looked gray and shrunken. "It's the business," Dad had said, his voice trembling. "The IRS, a discrepancy. They've frozen the operating accounts, Nancy, just until the audit clears." "They're going to take the house," Mom had sobbed, clutching my hand. Her grip was iron tight. "They're going to put a lien on everything. We have to pay a bond to keep operations running or we lose the contracts. If we lose the contracts, we lose everything." They needed exactly $100,000. "It's a bridge loan," Dad promised, looking me in the eye. 30 days, 45 tops. As soon as the audit unfreezes the assets, you get it back with interest. You're the only one we can ask, Nance. You're the responsible one. We can't ask Ethan. You know how he is with money." I hesitated. Every alarm bell in my head rang. That money was my house. It was 7 years of skipped vacations and overtime. "We wouldn't ask if it weren't life or death," Mom whispered. "We're family. Family helps family. That's the deal." That was the phrase that did it. That's the deal. I transferred the money the next morning. I felt sick doing it, but I also felt a strange, toxic swell of pride. I was the savior. I was the capable one. I had saved the family. Then came the engagement. A week after I wired the money, Ethan proposed to Madison. Madison was nice enough in that glossy, high-maintenance way that required constant validation, but she wasn't the problem. The problem was the snowball. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime event," Mom had chirped, her tears from the audit miraculously dried up. The wedding planning started fast and furious. The guest list swelled from 100 to 300. The venue shifted from a local country club to the Gilded Oak. I was dragged along to tastings and fittings not as a guest of honor but as a beast of burden. I addressed envelopes. I negotiated with florists. I drove across 3 counties to find the specific shade of dusty sage napkin Madison required. Whenever I asked Dad about the repayment, he was evasive. "The IRS moves at a glacial pace, honey. You know government work. Soon. I promise." I believed him because I needed to believe him. The alternative was too terrible to consider. But standing outside the service entrance with the coordinator's words ringing in my ears, card ending in 4492, the alternative crashed into me. I walked numbly into the venue, finding a quiet corner in a service corridor near the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the programs. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app again. I didn't just look at the balance this time. I dug into the transaction history. I scrolled back to the day of the transfer. I had wired the money to a joint account, an old checking account my parents had set up for me when I was 16, one I never used but had never formally removed them from. Dad had said to put it there so he could quickly certify it for the auditors. I clicked on that joint account. The $100,000 credit was there on October 12th. On October 14th, there was a debit for $25,000. The Gilded Oak, deposit. On October 20th, a debit for $12,000. Luxe Floral Designs. On November 1st, a debit for $500. Prestige Entertainment. I scrolled, my breath catching in my throat. The list went on. The custom dress, the vintage Rolls-Royce rental, the imported wine, the engagement party that I had attended where I had stood in the corner and eaten a slider, thinking about how tight money was for my parents. They hadn't used my money to save the business. There was no audit. There was no frozen asset. They had used my life savings to throw a party for Ethan. I looked at the dates. The emergency meeting at the kitchen table had happened 2 days after Ethan had privately told them he was going to propose. They knew. They knew they couldn't afford the wedding Ethan and Mom wanted, so they looked at their reliable daughter, saw a piggy bank, and smashed it open. Nancy. I jumped, shoving my phone into my pocket. My mother swept down the corridor, a vision in mother of the groom champagne silk. She looked radiant. She looked expensive. "Where have you been?" she hissed, though she maintained a bright public-facing smile. "The guests are starting to take their seats. Did you bring the programs?" I looked at her. I really looked at her. For the first time in my life, I didn't see my mother. I saw a stranger who had looked me in the eye, cried fake tears, and stolen my future because she thought I was too weak to do anything about it. "I have them," I said. My voice sounded calm. It terrified me. "Well, go put them in the baskets at the entrance, and fix your hair. You look like you've been sleeping in your car." She reached out and plucked a piece of lint off my shoulder, a gesture of ownership. "Smile, Nancy. It's a happy day." She turned and floated back toward the laughter and clinking glasses. I stood alone in the corridor. The smell of searing steak and expensive perfume filled the air. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It had slowed to a cold, heavy thud. She was right. It was a happy day, for them. I checked my phone one last time. The balance on the joint account was $412.18. My down payment was gone. My renovation budget was gone. The security I had built dollar by agonizing dollar had been converted into floral arrangements that would be dead by tomorrow morning. I realized then that the feeling washing over me wasn't just anger. It was derealization. It felt like the walls were dissolving. They had edited my life without my consent. They had decided that my dreams were convertible currency for Ethan's happiness. I walked toward the ceremony entrance, clutching the programs. I placed them in the baskets. I smiled at a cousin I hadn't seen in years. I walked to my seat in the second row, not the first that was for immediate family, and apparently I only counted as family when a check needed to be written. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap. The wedding was not just lavish, it was built out of my bones, and nobody was planning to tell me. They thought the transaction was complete. They thought I was just the silent, supportive sister who would eventually be told some sob story about why the money was gone. They thought they had gotten away with it. I watched Ethan stand at the altar, looking handsome and nervous. I watched my parents beaming in the front row, holding hands, the picture of generous, loving patriarchs. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the lilies that I had paid for. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. First, I needed to make sure I wasn't the only one who paid for this wedding. The ceremony was a blur of white lace and lies. I sat in the second row watching my brother recite vows about honesty and partnership, words that felt like they were being physically pulled out of my own ribcage. Every time the officiant spoke about building a life together, I thought about the foundation of my own life, the Miller house, the contractor. I had tentatively scheduled for next month, the paint swatches sitting on my dining table crumbling into dust to pay for the weeping cherry trees flanking the altar. As the guests applauded and Ethan kissed his bride, a dark, cold clarity settled over me. This wasn't a sudden accident. The transaction history I'd seen in the corridor was just the smoking gun. The crime had been in progress for weeks. I had been investigating this murder of my future without even realizing it. I investigated like a survivor, not a victim. My mind drifted back to 10 days ago. That was when the first crack had appeared. I had been sitting at my desk at work staring at a spreadsheet when a venue invoice for the Gilded Oak pinged into my junk folder. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. But the subject line had my name, Nancy Collins, final floral adjustment. I opened it. The total was $4,000 for imported white hydrangeas. My stomach had dropped. I called Mom immediately. "Oh, that," she had said, her voice airy and dismissive over the phone. "Just a clerical error, sweetie. I used your email as a backup contact because Dad's inbox is a mess. Don't worry, the business account covered it." "But why is my name on the billing line?" I asked, gripping the phone. "Nancy, stop being so bureaucratic. It's handled. Focus on being happy for your brother." She hung up before I could ask for a receipt. That night, I didn't sleep. I started digging. I went through old texts, piecing together the timeline of the audit. Dad claimed the freeze happened on October 10th. But on October 12th, Ethan posted a photo of a new watch on Instagram, a tag heuer. Caption, "Wedding gift from the best parents ever." I printed the screenshot. I printed the clerical error invoice. I printed the email from the bank confirming the wire transfer I had sent them. 3 days later, 1 week before the wedding, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't go to fight. I went to give them an off-ramp. I still believed stupidly that there was a misunderstanding. I thought maybe they were just reckless, not predatory. The memory of that afternoon in their living room burned hotter than the sun beating down on the wedding tent. I found them in the sunroom drinking iced tea. The house was calm, oblivious to the storm I was carrying. "We need to talk about the repayment," I said, standing over them. I didn't sit. "The 30 days are up. The contractor for the Miller house needs the deposit by the 1st of the month." Dad sighed, folding his newspaper. It was a sound of profound inconvenience. "Nancy, we're in the middle of wedding week. Can this wait?" "No," I said. "It can't. I need the money back, Dad. Or at least half of it. Now." Mom set her glass down with a sharp clink. "You are being incredibly selfish. Your brother is getting married. Do you have any idea the stress we are under? I gave you that money for a tax emergency," I said, my voice trembling. "To save the business, not for a wedding." They exchanged a look. It was a microscopic glance, a flicker of shared annoyance. That was the moment I knew there was no tax emergency. "Nancy," Dad said, his voice dropping to that reasonable, paternal tone he used to manage clients. "The business is complicated. Funds are fluid. We had to prioritize. We thought you of all people would understand. You don't need the cash right this second. It's sitting in a savings account." "It's for a house," I snapped. "A fixer-upper," Mom corrected, wrinkling her nose. "A money pit. Ethan is starting a family. That's real life. You're single. You have low overhead. Why are you so obsessed with that money? It's not like you have children to provide for." The cruelty of it took my breath away. It wasn't just a refusal to pay. It was a reframing of reality. In their narrative, my stability was a defect. My savings were proof that I didn't need anything. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked, feeling the tears prick my eyes. Tears of rage, not sadness. "When were you going to tell me you spent it?" "We didn't spend it." Dad lied effortlessly. "We leveraged it. You'll get it back eventually. Stop making this ugly. If you make a scene now, you'll ruin the week. Do you want that on your conscience?" "You always think you're the main character," Mom added, delivering the final blow. "You're jealous because for once the attention isn't on how responsible Nancy is. It's on Ethan. Grow up." I left the house shaking. I sat in my car in their driveway for 20 minutes, unable to put the key in the ignition. They weren't confused. They weren't desperate. They were entitled. They looked at me and saw a resource, not a person. That was when the investigation turned into a war for survival. I didn't go home. I went to see my best friend Sarah, who works in forensic accounting. I laid the printed screenshots and the clerical error invoice on her kitchen table. She looked at them for a long time, her face pale. "Nancy," she said softly, "this isn't borrowing. This is theft." If they used your identity to sign contracts or access accounts you didn't authorize, it's fraud, federal fraud. They're my parents, I whispered. They're grifters, she corrected. You have two choices. You can be the good daughter and lose 100 grand, or you can be the bad guy and get your life back. I went to the bank the next day. I spoke to a fraud specialist. I didn't file the formal report. Then I hesitated. The conditioning of 30 years is a heavy chain to break. But I got the paperwork. I learned the terms: unjust enrichment, conversion of funds, unauthorized use of credit. I carried that knowledge through the rehearsal dinner like a concealed weapon. The dinner was held last night at a seafood bistro on the water. I sat at the end of the table listening to relatives toast my parents. To Patricia and Robert, an uncle shouted, raising a glass of Cabernet. For their incredible generosity, this wedding is a masterpiece. Hear, hear, the room roared. I watched my father smile a humble, benevolent smile. I watched my mother dab her eyes, accepting the praise for a party she hadn't paid for. Every clap of applause felt like it was stripping skin from my body. They were buying social capital with my labor. They were basking in a spotlight powered by my darkness. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I sat there and ate my salad, and I finally understood that keeping the peace was just a fancy way of agreeing to be a victim. Snap back to the present. The wedding ceremony ended. The string quartet played something upbeat as the bridal party recessed down the aisle. I stood up, smoothing my dress. The guests began to migrate toward the cocktail hour on the terrace, the raw bar, the one the coordinator had asked me about. I walked toward the main house, avoiding the crowd. I needed to breathe. I found myself in a quiet courtyard near the side of the estate, a place lined with manicured hedges and stone benches. I was leaning against a pillar, trying to stop my hands from shaking, when a voice spoke from the shadows. I thought that was you. I turned. Standing there adjusting his cufflinks was Caleb Hart. He looked older than I remembered, lines of stress around his eyes. But he had the same steady, observant gaze that had saved me in high school. He wasn't a billionaire playboy. He was the CEO of a regional logistics tech firm, a guy who built things that worked. He was wearing a suit that fit him perfectly, but he looked as uncomfortable with the pageantry as I felt. Caleb, I said, the surprise momentarily cutting through my rage. What are you doing here? My company handles the logistics for the bride's father's distribution chain, he said, stepping closer. Corporate obligation. I'm hiding from the past hors d'oeuvres. What's your excuse? You look like you're planning a murder or a heist. He said it lightly, a joke, but his eyes narrowed as he looked at me. He saw it. He always saw it. In high school, when I dropped my tray in the cafeteria and the whole room laughed, Caleb hadn't made a big show of helping me. He had just quietly sat down at the empty table next to me and started a conversation about calculus, forcing the room to move on. Neither, I said, my voice brittle. Just realizing I paid for the hors d'oeuvres you're hiding from. He paused. He didn't laugh. He looked at me, really looked at me, and the social mask dropped. You don't look okay, Nancy. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was just that I had no one else in this zip code who knew the truth, but I told him. I didn't give him the sobbing victim story. I gave him the bullet points: the audit, the transfer, the discovery of the joint account history in the hallway. He listened without interrupting. He didn't get angry on my behalf. He got analytical. That was what I needed. Anger is cheap. Logic is leverage. Do you have the documentation? He asked quietly. Screenshots, invoices, the bank transfer record. Is your name on the venue contract? The coordinator asked me about the bill. I think the whole account is in my name, or at least the billing profile is. Caleb nodded, looking toward the tent where the party was starting. Then you have leverage, but you have to decide what the goal is. Do you want to hurt them, or do you want to make yourself whole? I want them to stop lying, I said, and I want my future back. Then don't scream, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, writing a number on the back. This is my personal attorney. He handles corporate fraud, but he knows how to freeze assets. If you decide to go nuclear, text me. I can get a cease and desist drafted in an hour. But Nancy, once you pull that trigger, the family is gone. You have to be ready for that. The family was gone the minute the check cleared, I said. He looked at me with a profound, sad respect. You're right. Stay safe. He didn't try to save me. He didn't offer to write a check and fix it. He handed me a weapon and let me decide whether to use it. That was the most respectful thing anyone had done for me in months. I put the card in my purse and walked back toward the party. I felt different. Heavier but solid. I wasn't floating anymore. I found my family near the entrance to the reception tent. They were posing for photos. Ethan had his arm around Mom. Dad was holding a scotch. Mom saw me approaching and her smile tightened. She excused herself from the photographer and intercepted me before I could reach the group. She grabbed my elbow, her fingernails digging in through the fabric of my dress. "Fix your face," she hissed. "You look miserable. People are staring." "Let them stare," I said. "Nancy, listen to me." She whispered, her voice a venomous low frequency. "I know you're upset about the money. But if you say one word to anyone, if you cause a scene today, you will be cut off. No Christmas, no birthdays. You will be the pariah of this family. Everyone will know you as the unstable, jealous sister who couldn't handle Ethan's happiness." Ethan drifted over, swirling his drink. He looked flushed, happy, and utterly unbothered. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between us. "Nancy is having a moment," Mom said. "Come on, Nance," Ethan groaned. "Not today, just be cool, okay? You said you'd help. Don't back out now just because you're stressed." I looked at him, the golden child. "Did you know?" I asked him. "Did you know where the money came from?" Ethan looked away. He looked at the floor, then at his beautiful bride across the lawn. "Does it matter? It's done. We're family. It all comes out in the wash." He knew. He didn't know the mechanics maybe, but he knew I had paid. And he didn't care. "You're right," I said softly. "It is done." They took my silence for submission. Mom patted my arm, satisfied. "Good girl. Go find your seat. Table 19, by the kitchen." I watched them walk away, back to the light, back to the applause. I stood there on the edge of the perfectly manicured lawn, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. I took out my phone. I opened the Notes app where I had drafted a speech at 3:00 a.m. 2 nights ago, a speech I had told myself I would never give. I opened my banking app. I opened the email from the venue that had the contract attached, the contract I had located in my spam folder during my investigation phase, the one signed electronically with my name. I realized I had 3 levers. Lever A, the contract. The venue thought I was the client. That meant I controlled the event. I could freeze the bar. I could stop the music. I could cancel the night. Lever B, the truth. I had the microphone access for the sisters' toast. I had the receipts. I could dismantle their reputation in 3 minutes flat. Lever C, the law. I had the PDF of the police report I had filled out but not submitted. One button press. I wasn't going to use just one. I was going to use them all. My mother thought she had silenced me with the threat of being an outcast. She didn't understand. You can't threaten someone with exile when they've already walked out the door. I smoothed my dress again. I checked my makeup in my phone camera. I looked calm. I looked like the dutiful sister. I stepped onto the wedding grounds, the gravel crunching beneath my feet like the bones of the life they had stolen from me. The reception was starting. The speeches were next. I checked the time. 6:15 p.m. By 6:30 p.m., the Collins family image was going to be nothing but ash. I walked into the tent. The air inside the reception tent was thick enough to choke on a humid blend of expensive champagne prime rib and the cloying scent of thousands of white lilies. I sat at table 19, positioned conveniently near the kitchen swing doors. Every time a server kicked the door open with a tray of cleared plates, a blast of hot, dishwater-scented air hit the back of my neck. It was perfect. It was exactly where they thought I belonged. I watched the room with a detached, hyper-real clarity. The crystal chandeliers overhead caught the light in a way that made everything look soft and dreamlike. The band was playing a jazz standard low and smooth. My parents were at the head table glowing. They looked like royalty. Dad was laughing at something the father of the bride said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who has provided well for his family. Mom was holding court, touching the arm of a wealthy aunt, accepting praise for the impeccable details. Ethan and Madison were kissing for the camera, a staged moment of bliss. I looked down at my hands. They were resting on the white tablecloth, still and pale. I felt insane. I felt like I was the only person in the room seeing the world in color while everyone else was watching a black and white movie. I was sitting inside the carcass of my own life, watching them pick the bones clean and call it a celebration. Then came the trigger. It wasn't a shout or a crash. It was a toast. Ethan stood up, tapping a knife against his champagne flute. The room went silent. The band stopped playing. I just want to say, Ethan began, his voice thick with emotion and good Scotch, that today has been a fairy tale, and I have to thank the two people who made it possible. He turned to our parents, raising his glass. Mom, Dad, you guys gave us everything. You sacrificed to give us this night. You are the rock of this family. I love you. The room erupted in applause. People stood up. To Robert and Patricia, someone shouted. My mother dabbed her eyes, looking humble. My father nodded solemnly, accepting the lie as if it were his birthright. They were erasing me. It wasn't enough to steal the money. They had to steal the credit, too. They were rewriting history in real time, and if I stayed silent for 10 more seconds, that version of history would become the truth. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the venue coordinator, the same woman from the parking lot. She looked apologetic, holding a portable credit card terminal. Ms. Collins, she whispered, crouching down so as not to disturb the applause. I'm so sorry to bother you during the speeches, but the authorization for the open bar extension just timed out. We need a physical swipe to keep the premium liquor flowing for the next 2 hours. It's another $4,000. She held the machine out to me, expectant. I looked at the machine. I looked at Ethan basking in the applause paid for by my renovation budget. I looked at my mother performing the role of the benevolent matriarch. Ms. Collins, the coordinator whispered. One moment, I said. I didn't take the machine. I stood up. My legs felt light, like they were filled with helium. I walked past the coordinator. I walked past table 19. I walked past the dance floor. The applause was dying down, the guests settling back into their seats for the next course. I didn't stop until I reached the band's stage. The lead singer looked at me confused, but I stepped past him and took the microphone from the stand. The feedback whined a sharp, high-pitched screech that made half the room wince. Silence fell instantly. Absolute terrified silence. I saw my mother's head snap toward me. Her face went from beatific to horrified in a microsecond. She started to rise from her chair, her mouth forming my name. Ethan, I said. My voice boomed through the speakers, louder than I expected, but steady. Cold. I wanted you to have joy. I really did. Ethan stared at me, his smile faltering. Nancy, what are you doing? I wanted to add a correction to the toast. I continued, gripping the mic stand. You thanked Mom and Dad for sacrificing to pay for this night, but they didn't pay for it. Nancy, sit down. My father was up now, moving around the head table with surprising speed. I didn't look at him. I looked at the 300 guests. This wedding cost $112,000, and every cent of it was taken from my savings account money I saved for 7 years to buy a home under the pretense of a tax audit that never existed. A gasp rippled through the room. It wasn't a movie gasp. It was a confused, uncomfortable murmur. Nancy, stop it, Mom screamed, abandoning all pretense of grace. She was rushing toward the stage now, her face twisted in a snarl. She's off her medication. She's having an episode. I don't take medication, Mom, I said into the mic. But I do take receipts. I pulled my phone from my clutch and held it up. I knew they couldn't read the screen from the tables, but the gesture was enough. October 12th, $100,000 transfer. October 14th, $25,000 deposit to the Gilded Oak, authorized by Nancy Collins. Cut the mic! Dad yelled at the sound guy. Cut it now! The sound guy looked panicked, his hands hovering over the board. I am the billing contact on the contract, I said, my voice cutting through the rising chaos. If you cut this mic, I will sue this venue for breach of service before the sun comes up. The sound guy froze. He didn't cut it. My father reached the stage. He reached up to grab my arm, his face purple with rage. You ungrateful little... Don't touch her! The voice came from the side of the stage. Caleb Hart stepped out from the shadows near the speaker stack. He didn't look like he was crashing a party. He looked like he was chairing a board meeting. He stepped between my father and me, not aggressively but like a wall. Who the hell are you? Dad spat. I'm a witness, Caleb said calmly. He looked at the security guard who was tentatively approaching. I've seen the bank records, the fraud alerts, and the venue contract. Ms. Collins is the legal financier of this event. She has the floor. Dad hesitated. He recognized Caleb. Everyone in local business recognized Caleb Hart. The shame of being called out by a man with real power paralyzed him. I looked back at the crowd. They were dead silent now. The gossip had stopped. They were watching a family dissolve. I won't be silent to protect a lie anymore, I said into the mic. I looked directly at Ethan. He was sitting in his chair, pale as a sheet, looking at his wife. Madison had her hands over her mouth. I filed a report for financial fraud this morning. The police have the records. This isn't a family dispute. It's a crime. You ruined my wedding, Ethan screamed, finding his voice at last. He stood up, knocking his chair over. You selfish bitch. You did this on purpose. No, Ethan, I said. I paid for your wedding. There's a difference. My mother had reached the stage now, but Caleb blocked her path. She turned to the crowd, her arms wide, desperate. Please don't listen to her. She's always been jealous of him. She's making this up for attention. Ms. Collins. I called out to the coordinator, who was still standing by table 19, clutching the credit card machine like a lifeline. The coordinator looked up, terrified. I am the client of record? Is that correct? I asked. Yes, she squeaked. And the contract states that the primary billing contact has the right to modify or cease services at any time. Yes, ma'am. I looked at my parents. I looked at the luxury I had slaved for. Then I am exercising that right, I said. As of this moment, I am revoking authorization for all charges on card 4492. Freeze the bar, stop the catering, and turn off the music. The party is over. I dropped the microphone. It hit the stage floor with a deafening thud that echoed like a gunshot. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the logistics took over. The coordinator, terrified of a chargeback war she couldn't win, signaled the bar manager. The bartenders immediately stopped pouring. They began capping bottles. The band, realizing they might not get paid for the extra set, put their instruments down. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a machine breaking down. No, Mom shrieked. You can't do this. Turn the music back on. She grabbed a waiter. Get me champagne. I'm sorry, ma'am, the waiter mumbled, backing away. The account is frozen. The fairy tale didn't end with a bang. It ended with the clatter of silverware and the murmur of confused guests asking if they should leave. I stepped off the stage. My legs were shaking so hard I thought I might fall, but I kept walking. I walked straight down the center aisle, the same path the bride had taken. Nancy, Dad yelled after me. If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back. I didn't turn around. I didn't stop. Caleb fell into step beside me, walking a few feet away, acting as a buffer against the shocked stares of the guests. Did you do it? He asked quietly. I did it, I breathed. Keep walking, he said. Don't look back. I walked out of the tent and into the cool night air. The humidity had broken. The sky was a deep bruised purple. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of the reception disintegrating, Ethan shouting, my mother sobbing, the low buzz of 300 people realizing they had witnessed a demolition. I reached my car in the overflow lot. My hand was shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the lock. Here, Caleb said. He gently took the keys from my hand, unlocked the door, and handed them back. Are you okay to drive? I don't know, I said. I looked at him. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving me cold and hollow. I hadn't felt the triumph I expected. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like an orphan. I realized then that revenge isn't sweet. It's just necessary. It's like amputating a gangrenous limb. You don't celebrate losing the arm. You just celebrate that the infection won't kill you. I'm okay, I lied. I just need to go. Go, Caleb said. I'll stay here and make sure no one follows you. I'll call you tomorrow. I got into my dented Honda. I started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I looked in the rearview mirror. The white tent was glowing in the distance, beautiful and rot-filled. I had dropped the bomb. The truth was out. But as I turned onto the dark highway, the terror finally hit me. I had burned the bridge, but I was still standing on the edge of the cliff. The silence in the car was deafening. Consequences don't end at the microphone. They were just beginning. My phone was a grenade sitting in the passenger seat. For the first 20 minutes of the drive, it just vibrated against the leather, short, angry bursts that I could feel in my teeth. Then the screen started lighting up the dark interior of the car like a strobe light. Texts, missed calls, Instagram tags. The digital fallout was traveling faster than I was. I didn't go back to my apartment. I didn't want to be alone, but I also didn't want to be found. I drove to Sarah's place. She was the only person in the world who wouldn't ask me how could you, because she was the one who had told me you have to. When I walked into her small second-floor walk-up, the smell of pepperoni pizza and stale coffee hit me like a physical embrace. It smelled like reality. Sarah didn't say a word. She just pulled me onto her lumpy beige sofa and handed me a glass of cheap red wine. It's online, she said quietly after I'd stared at the wall for 10 minutes. What? Someone was recording. A cousin, I think. It's on TikTok. Sister ruins wedding with receipts. It has 40,000 views already. I took the phone from her. The video was shaky, filmed vertically from a table back near the entrance. I looked small on the stage, a tiny figure in a blue dress, holding a microphone like a weapon. But my voice was crystal clear. I paid for your wedding. There's a difference. The comments, I asked, bracing myself. Mixed, Sarah said, taking the phone back. Half of them think you're a hero. The other half think you're a monster who should have waited until Monday. But Nancy, nobody thinks you're lying. That was the first aftershock, the realization that the truth was out there independent of me now. I couldn't take it back if I wanted to. The secrecy that my parents had relied on, the shadow where they operated, had been burned away by the harsh light of the internet. The next morning, the adrenaline hangover hit. My body felt bruised, heavy, like I'd been in a car wreck. But the machinery I had set in motion didn't care about my exhaustion. At 9:00 a.m., the bank's fraud department called. Ms. Collins, the representative said, his voice clipped and professional. We've received your affidavit. Given the documentation of the unauthorized transfers and the venue contract in your name, we have frozen the joint account. We are also issuing chargebacks for the vendors that haven't fully processed yet. However, the emergency loan transfer you made voluntarily, that's going to be harder to claw back. That looks like a gift in the eyes of the law. It wasn't a gift, I said, rubbing my temples. It was obtained under false pretenses. We can pursue that, he said. But you'll need legal counsel to formalize the fraud claim against the account holders, your parents. I hung up and called the number on the back of the business card Caleb had given me. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, didn't offer sympathy. He offered strategy. "We send a civil demand letter today," Henderson said. "We outline a repayment plan. If they refuse, we file a suit for conversion and unjust enrichment. And Nancy, lock your credit, today. If they felt comfortable draining your savings, they won't hesitate to open a card in your name to patch the holes you just punched in their finances." I spent the next hour freezing my credit at all 3 bureaus. It was a mundane bureaucratic task, but every click felt like I was boarding up the windows of my soul. Then the family fallout began. Mom called first. I let it go to voicemail. Then she texted. A wall of text. "How could you? You've destroyed us. Aunt Linda is leaving. The venue is threatening to sue us because the card declined on the incidentals. You need to fix this. Tell everyone you were drunk. Tell them you were off your meds. If you love this family, fix this." She wasn't apologizing. She was mourning her reputation. She was still trying to direct the play, even after the theater had burned down. Dad called next. I answered mostly because I needed to know if he was going to threaten me physically. "Nancy," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly calm, the voice of a man trying to close a deal that was going sideways. "Let's be reasonable. We can work this out. I can liquidate some assets. I can get you the money back over the next 5 years, but you have to take down the post. You have to issue a retraction." "I didn't post the video, Dad," I said, "and I can't retract the truth." "We'll pay you back," he pleaded. "Just say you lied. Say it was a misunderstanding. We can't survive this scandal, Nancy. The business relies on trust." "So did I said. "I relied on trust. You spent it on hydrangeas." I hung up. Ethan didn't call. He showed up at Sarah's apartment at noon. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was still wearing his tuxedo pants and a t-shirt. He pounded on the door until I opened it. He pushed past me, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "Madison is at her mother's," he spat. "She left the hotel at 2:00 a.m. She says she can't be married to a fraud. Are you happy you wanted to ruin my life and you did it?" "I didn't steal 100,000 from you, Ethan," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I felt strangely calm. "I stopped you from spending mine." "I didn't know," he shouted. "I thought Dad handled it." "Stop," I said. I said it soft, but it stopped him cold. "Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't know." He looked at me. His face crumpled. The golden child veneer cracked, revealing the weak, spoiled boy underneath. I knew money was tight," he whispered, looking at the floor. "I knew Dad was scrambling, but I didn't ask. I didn't want to know, Nance. I just wanted the wedding." "That's worse," I said. "You let me bleed because you liked the party." He left without another word. He didn't apologize. He just walked out the door, clicking shut on the relationship I had spent my whole life trying to maintain. Later that afternoon, Caleb met me at a coffee shop down the street. He didn't come in a suit. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie. He looked human. "I saw the video," he said, handing me a latte. "You held the line." "I feel like I nuked my own life," I admitted. "You didn't," he said firmly. "You survived an attack. It feels like destruction because you're used to being the structure that holds them up. But you're not the foundation anymore, Nancy. You're the tenant who finally moved out." He didn't try to hold my hand. He didn't promise that everything would be okay. He just sat there with me drinking black coffee, proving that a person could know the ugly truth about me and not run away. "The lawyer sent the demand letter," I told him. "Good," Caleb said. "Keep going. Don't accept a promise. Accept a wire transfer." I went back to Sarah's that night. We ordered Thai food and sat on the floor. I looked around the messy, comfortable apartment. This was my community. Sarah, who checked my math. Caleb, who checked my safety. People who offered pizza and legal referrals, not gaslighting and theft. I realized that family wasn't the people who shared your DNA. It was the people who respected your boundaries. I was just starting to feel a tiny, fragile sense of peace when my phone buzzed again. It was a voicemail from the bank representative I had spoken to earlier. I frowned, putting the phone to my ear. Ms. Collins, this is David from the fraud department again. I'm calling because, well, in the process of freezing the joint account and investigating the transfer history for your claim, we found something else. It appears this wasn't the only account connected to your profile that your parents had access to. We found a secondary custodial investment account in your name, one opened when you were a minor in 1998. It was valued at roughly $40,000 as of 2 months ago. He paused, and the silence on the recording made my blood turn to ice. The balance is zero, Ms. Collins. It was liquidated 3 weeks ago, and the beneficiary withdrawal was signed by a Robert Collins using a power of attorney document that appears to be dated from when you were 18. You need to come in tomorrow. This is much bigger than the wedding. I lowered the phone. The room seemed to stretch and warp. The wedding wasn't the crime. The wedding was just the tip of the iceberg. They hadn't just skimmed off the top to throw a party. They had hollowed me out completely. The discovery of the second account didn't break me. It calcified me. The $100,000 for the wedding was a betrayal of trust, but the liquidation of my childhood investment account using a 20-year-old power of attorney was a felony. It was the difference between a family dispute and a prison sentence. I didn't cry this time. I walked into Mr. Henderson's office the next morning with the bank records and a cold, flat determination. They used a document from when I was 18, I told him. I want it revoked, and I want to use this as leverage. They pay me back, or I press charges for the unauthorized use of the POA. Henderson looked at the papers, then at me. He nodded. This is the nail in the coffin, Nancy. This proves a pattern of financial predation. We have them. The resolution wasn't a tidy bow. It was a surrender treaty. We met 3 days later in a sterile conference room. My parents sat on one side of the mahogany table looking gray and shrunken. The shine of the wedding day was gone, replaced by the haggard look of people who had been publicly dismantled. They wouldn't look me in the eye. I didn't ask for an apology. I asked for a signature. The terms were brutal but necessary. They agreed to liquidate a portion of the business assets, machinery, a company vehicle, and a small parcel of land to repay the $140,000 they had stolen. It would take 6 months to get the full amount, but the first installment of $50,000 was wired that afternoon. You're bankrupting us, my father muttered as he signed the repayment agreement, his hand shaking. After everything we did for you, you're bleeding the business dry. No, Dad, I said, sliding the papers across the table. I'm just taking back the blood you already drained. There's a difference. I stood up. The power of attorney is revoked. If you ever attempt to access my credit, my medical records, or my accounts again, the fraud report I filed goes active. This is the last time we speak about money. In fact, this is the last time we speak about anything until you can learn to see me as a daughter instead of an ATM. My mother started to cry, the same weaponized tears she had used to get the loan in the first place. We just wanted a nice day for your brother. We just wanted to be a family. You bought a party, I said. You sold the family to pay for it. I walked out of the conference room. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light. It was the weightlessness of a prisoner who had finally sawed through the last chain. I met Ethan a week later. He looked like a ghost. Madison had gone through with the annulment. It turns out finding out your husband's wealth is actually his sister's stolen life savings is a mood killer. He met me at a park sitting on a bench staring at the ducks. She left, he said simply. I know, I said. Why didn't you just tell me, Nance, before the wedding? We could have fixed it. I tried, I said. You didn't want to hear it. You liked the fairy tale too much to check the price tag. He looked at me, his eyes red. I don't know what to do. Mom and Dad are broke. I'm alone. I don't know. Are you okay? Can you help me figure this out? It was a reflex, an old instinct kicking in, the urge to fix him, to be the reliable one. I felt it rise in my chest. And then I killed it. I love you, Ethan, I said. But I won't be your foundation anymore. You have to build your own floor. I can't help you. I stood up and walked away. I left him on the bench. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, and it was the most loving thing I could do for myself. 2 months later. I didn't get the Miller house. The market moved too fast, and with the legal delays, I lost the bid. But I found something else. I stood in the center of a small, sun-drenched loft downtown. It wasn't a Victorian mansion. It was a single room with exposed brick and a view of the fire escape. But the lease was in my name. The deposit had come from my own recovered funds. The key in my pocket belonged to me, and no one else had a copy. I took a deep breath. The air smelled like dust and floor wax, an absolute terrifying freedom. I had recovered about 70% of my money so far. The rest was coming. But standing there listening to the hum of the city outside, I realized the money was just paper. The real asset I had reclaimed was my reality. My phone buzzed. It was Caleb. Coffee. I smiled. We met at the cafe around the corner. He didn't treat me like a victim, and he didn't treat me like a conquest. He treated me like an equal. "How's the new place?" he asked, blowing on his Americano. "It's small," I said, "but the locks work." "That's all that matters," he said. He reached across the table not to hold my hand, but to tap his knuckles against mine. A fist bump of solidarity. "You did good, Nancy. You burned it down, but you're still standing." "Yeah," I said. "I am." We didn't ride off into the sunset. We just drank our coffee and talked about logistics, about the future, about things that were real and solid. It wasn't a romance novel ending. It was better. It was the first chapter of a biography that I was finally writing myself. That evening, I drove past the Gilded Oak on my way back to the loft. The venue was dark. The white tent was gone. It looked ordinary, just a patch of grass and some old trees. It looked small. I slowed the car, looking at the spot where I had stood on stage, and dismantled the lie. I felt a phantom twinge of fear, remembering the shaking of my hands, the heat of the spotlight. But then it passed, replaced by the cool night air. My parents had their pride battered as it was. Ethan had his freedom unwanted as it was. And I had the truth. They spent my money on a party. I spent my voice on my freedom. I accelerated, watching the venue disappear in the rearview mirror until it was nothing but a speck of darkness behind me. Mine lasts longer. And so Nancy finally claimed the piece that had been stolen from her, learning that the true cost of autonomy is often the boundary you must be willing to defend. If you were shocked by Nancy's family betrayal, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single comment of your thoughts on this incredible story of reclaiming self-worth. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark side of family dynamics, please subscribe for more true stories of consequence. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.